I've kept my mouth shut for almost 4 years, because who's going to believe a backwoods distiller who says he had an encounter with something that isn't supposed to exist? But after what happened during that fire, I can't keep quiet anymore. I still run my operation, still live alone in these same hills. But everything changed after that night. Everything. Let me back up and tell you how this whole thing started. I moved into the Ozarks when I was 32. That was 19 years ago, give or take. I didn't come here running from the law, not exactly. I came here because I wanted to disappear, and these hills let you do that better than anywhere else in this country. The terrain is brutal. The roads dead end into nothing. Cell service doesn't exist. The kind of place where a man can build a life, and the rest of the world won't notice he's missing. And I wasn't missing. Not to anyone who mattered. I found my spot after weeks of hiking, a hollow tucked between two ridges, maybe 40 minutes from the nearest county road if you knew the trail. If you didn't know it, you could walk past it 100 times and never see the cabin. That was the point. I built the place myself over the course of 2 summers. Nothing fancy. A single room, a wood stove, a porch that faced east so I could watch the light come in through the canopy every morning. It was the closest thing to peace I'd ever known. The operation came later, but not much later. I'd learned distillation from my grandfather back in Arkansas. Not moonshine, not the way people think of it. He taught me about essential oils first. Wintergreen, sassafras, the old botanicals that used to fill apothecaries before the pharmacies took over. I got curious about the alcohol side of things, the high-proof stuff, and found out there was a quiet market for it. Underground buyers, private collectors, people who wanted something clean and strong and off any record. I wasn't getting rich. I was getting by, and I was alone, which was all I ever wanted. The springs made it possible. There are natural water sources all through the Ozark Plateau, deep aquifers that push up through the limestone, cold and clean year-round. I tapped into one about 200 yards from the cabin, set up my still in a secondary structure I built into the hillside so it blended with the terrain. Smoke was the biggest risk, so I burned only hardwood and only on days when the wind carried it away from any road or trail. I was careful. I'd been careful for almost 2 decades. I thought I knew every inch of that land. I thought I understood what lived there, the deer, the black bears, the occasional bobcat that passed through. I knew the rhythm of the seasons, the way the fog settled into the valleys in October, the way the creek swelled in spring. I thought I had it all figured out. That was my first mistake, thinking you can ever really know a place. I should have paid more attention to the signs. Looking back now, they were there for months before I even noticed. But I was comfortable. I was routine. And when you've been alone that long, your mind fills in the gaps with whatever explanation keeps the silence from feeling too loud. It started small. So small, I almost missed it entirely. The first thing I noticed was the traps. I'd been setting snares along the eastern ridge for years. Nothing heavy, just wire loops for rabbits and the occasional squirrel. Practical stuff. I needed the meat, and hunting with a rifle drew attention I didn't want. One morning in late September, I made my rounds and found 3 of them dismantled. Not broken, not chewed through. Taken apart. The wire untwisted at the joints. The stakes pulled cleanly from the ground and laid side by side like someone had organized them. I stood there for a long time, staring at that neat little row of components. The wind moved through the pines above me, and I remember thinking, that's not how animals work. But I didn't stay with that thought, not long enough. I told myself it was hikers, maybe hunters from the county who'd stumbled onto my line and didn't like what they found. It was the simplest explanation, and out here, the simplest explanation usually holds. So I reset the traps and moved on. A week later, the trails changed. I had 3 main paths connecting my cabin to the spring, the still, and a lookout point on the northern ridge where I could scan for smoke or vehicles on the road below. I'd walked those paths so many times they were worn into the earth like old scars. One morning, I took the northern trail and found it blocked. Not by a fallen tree, not by a mudslide, by branches. Dozens of them, woven together with a kind of deliberate care, interlocked at angles that held firm even when I pushed against them. It wasn't a wall. It was a message. Something was telling me not to go that way. I cut through the weave with a machete and didn't think about it again for almost 2 days. That was the thing about living alone. There was no one to talk it through with, no one to say, "Hey, doesn't that seem strange to you?" The thoughts just came and went, and I let them go, because the alternative was sitting with unease I couldn't explain. And unexplained unease, out here, was a luxury I couldn't afford. Then the objects started appearing. The first one was a stone, smooth, about the size of my fist, placed on the porch railing directly in front of the door. Not a rock from the yard. This one was river-worn, the kind you'd find in the creek bed half a mile away. It was just sitting there when I came out at dawn, and I picked it up and turned it over in my hands like it was supposed to mean something. It didn't. Not yet. Over the next 3 weeks, more appeared. A piece of elk antler, broken cleanly at the base, left on the flat rock beside my water barrel. 2 smaller stones arranged in a line near the base of the still. A strip of birch bark, peeled in one long curl, draped over the doorframe like a ribbon. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was moved out of place. Only new things were added, and always with a strange, almost careful positioning. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this wasn't trying to frighten me. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. But here's what I didn't understand back then, and what kept me up at night later when I finally started putting the pieces together. Everything that was placed near my cabin was connected to the areas where I worked. The stones came from near the spring. The antler was found on the ground close to the still. Even the birch bark, I checked later. It had been stripped from a tree directly along my smoke line. Someone was mapping my operation, and they were showing me that they knew exactly where it was. I just wasn't ready to hear what that meant. By mid-October, I'd convinced myself it was environmentalists. There'd been a group of them active in the region a couple years back, young, loud, the kind who chained themselves to trees and left pamphlets on dashboard windshields at county road pull-offs. They'd been pushing hard against illegal operations in the national forest, and word traveled fast in these hills, even without cell service. Someone at the feed store in town mentioned them once when I came in for supplies. I didn't think much of it then. But now, with the traps being dismantled and the trails blocked and the strange little arrangements appearing around my property, the pieces seemed to fit. Radical environmentalists. That's what I told myself. People who'd found out about my still and were trying to scare me off the land without getting close enough to confront me directly. It made sense. It was a clean, human explanation. And clean, human explanations are what keep a man sleeping at night. I was wrong. But I wouldn't know that for a long time. So I tightened security. First, I extended my patrol route. Every morning and every evening, a full loop around the perimeter of my property, checking for footprints, disturbed ground, anything out of place. I moved slower, looked harder. The forest had always felt like it was mine, but now it felt like someone else was walking through it while I slept, and that feeling sat in my chest like a cold stone I couldn't swallow. I set up noise traps next. Simple things. Fishing line strung between trees at ankle height, connected to cans filled with gravel. Not dangerous, just loud. Enough to wake me if anything moved through the perimeter after dark. The first 2 nights, nothing tripped them. On the 3rd night, I woke to the sound of one going off near the eastern edge of my property and grabbed my rifle before I was fully conscious. Nothing was there. The line had snapped clean, and the can was on its side in the leaves. But the gravel hadn't scattered the way it would if something had kicked through it. It looked like someone had lifted the can, turned it over, and set it back down. I stood in the dark for a long time after that, listening. The woods were quiet in the way woods get quiet when something in them has gone still. That's when I started carrying the rifle everywhere. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a violent man. I never have been. The firearm was insurance, nothing more. A .30-06 I'd had since my 20s, well-maintained, reliable. I told myself I wasn't going to shoot anyone. I was going to fire warning shots. Into the air, into the ground, just enough noise and force to send a message back. I know you're here, and I'm not leaving. The first warning shot came 4 days later. I was checking the still in the early afternoon, gray sky, light mist hanging in the hollows, when I caught movement at the tree line. A shape, maybe 60 yards out, partially obscured by a stand of hickory. It was there, and then it wasn't. And I told myself it was a deer, but my hand was already on the rifle, and my heart was already beating faster than it should have been. I raised the rifle and fired into the canopy above where I'd seen the shape. The crack of the shot split the silence like something breaking open. Birds erupted from the trees in a black cloud, and for a few seconds the whole hollow rang with the echo. When it faded, the woods went quiet again. Dead quiet. The kind of quiet that feels less like an absence of sound and more like something listening. I lowered the rifle and stood there, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, was gone. But here's the thing that I kept coming back to, weeks later, when the real story started to unfold. I fired that shot to scare something away. And for a while, I thought it worked. The signs stopped for almost 10 days after that. I thought I'd won. I hadn't won anything. I'd just made them more careful. The 10 days of quiet almost lulled me back into routine. I kept patrolling, kept the rifle close, but the tension in my chest started to ease. No new objects appeared on the porch. No traps were touched. The woven branches I'd cut through on the northern trail stayed down. I started sleeping through the night again, and by the end of that 2nd week, I was almost convinced I'd scared them off for good. Then I saw them. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays were my supply days. I'd pack a bag the night before and make the long walk down to the county road, where I kept an old truck hidden under a tarp behind a stand of cedars. But that morning the mist was thick, clinging to everything like wet cloth, and I decided to wait. No point driving blind on those roads. So I stayed close to the cabin, split some wood, checked the still, kept myself busy. It was just past noon when I looked up from the woodpile and saw them. 2 figures. Standing at the far edge of the clearing, maybe 80 yards out, where the tree line thickened into shadow. The fog had lifted just enough to give me a clear sight line, and for a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, because they were wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't immediately put into words. They were too tall. That was the first thing. Not tall the way a man on stilts is tall. This was proportional. Their shoulders were broad, their limbs long, and they stood with a weight and stillness that reminded me less of people and more of old trees, like they'd grown there. I set the axe down slowly. My hand moved toward the rifle, leaning against the porch rail, but I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Something held me back. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the feeling you get when you realize you've been misreading a situation for weeks, and the ground is about to shift under your feet. They hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, just standing there, side by side, facing me across the hollow. And here's what unsettled me most. They weren't hiding. It was broad daylight, gray, foggy daylight, but daylight nonetheless. Whatever they weren't trying to avoid being seen. I took one step forward, then another. The one on the left, slightly shorter than the other, though still taller than any man I'd ever stood next to, turned its head. Not sharply, not the way an animal snaps its gaze toward a threat. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like it was making sure I saw it clearly before it did what came next. Then it turned and walked into the trees. The other one followed, not running, not rushing, walking at an unhurried pace, one behind the other, disappearing into the dark line of the forest like they were being swallowed by it. Within seconds, they were gone, and the hollow was empty again, and the only sound was the drip of moisture falling from the canopy above. I stood there for a long time. The mist curled around my ankles. The woodpile sat half-finished beside me. Everything looked exactly the way it had 5 minutes ago, and nothing felt the same. I picked up the rifle, checked the chamber out of habit. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat down on the porch steps and stayed there, without moving, without working, without thinking about anything useful. I just sat and stared at the tree line and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Bears. That was the word I kept coming back to. Black bears moved through this area, and in the fog, at that distance, maybe 2 bears side by side could look like... No, even as I told myself that, I knew it was wrong. Bears don't walk in formation. Bears don't turn their heads to make eye contact before they leave. Bears don't retreat in a calm, measured line like they've done it 1,000 times before. What I saw wasn't bears, and it wasn't environmentalists. I just didn't have a word for what it was yet. And that night, lying in the dark with the rifle across my lap and the noise traps armed in every direction, I kept replaying the way the shorter one had turned its head. That slow, careful look, almost like it was checking to see if I understood. I didn't. Not yet. But something had changed. The thing I was up against, whatever it was, had stopped hiding. And I didn't know if that meant I was closer to the truth or further from safety. For 3 days after I saw them, I barely slept. I kept the rifle loaded at all times, checked the perimeter every hour, sometimes more. The noise traps stayed armed from dusk to dawn, and I added 2 more lines closer to the cabin, wrapping them in a rough circle like a net. I told myself I was being cautious, prepared, but the truth is, I was afraid, not of being attacked, but of being watched and not knowing it. The feeling of eyes on the back of my neck that wouldn't go away no matter how many times I turned around. Nothing happened. No movement at the tree line. No objects on the porch. No traps dismantled. 3 days of silence, so complete it felt almost deliberate, like whoever, whatever, was out there, had decided to let me stew in my own uncertainty. And that's exactly what they did. On the fourth morning, I woke up later than usual. The light was already high and pale through the window, and for a moment I felt something close to normalcy. I made coffee on the wood stove, drank it on the porch, watched a hawk circle over the ridge. The woods looked the same as they always had. Quiet. Still. Beautiful in the way they always were, even now. Then I walked down to the generator shed. I kept a small diesel generator about 30 yards from the cabin, tucked behind a screen of brush I'd built years ago to hide the exhaust. I didn't use it often, only when I needed to run the small electric still for certain distillations, or charge the battery pack that powered a single light in the cabin. It was a workhorse, ugly and loud, and I maintained it the way I maintained everything out here, religiously, without shortcuts. That morning I opened the shed door and stopped cold. The generator was in pieces, not destroyed, not smashed or torn apart in anger or frustration. Every single component had been removed, carefully, methodically, and laid out on the ground in a clean, precise line. The fuel pump, the alternator housing, the starter motor, the carburetor, disassembled down to its individual parts. Each piece was separated by exactly the right amount of space, arranged in an order that followed the logic of how the machine worked, from intake to exhaust, from power source to output. Someone had taken my generator apart the way a mechanic would, the way someone who understood how it worked would. I crouched down beside the layout and stared at it for what felt like a very long time. My hands were shaking, not from cold, though the morning air was sharp, from something else. Something I didn't want to name yet, because naming it would mean accepting a reality I wasn't ready for. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't some radical with an axe to grind, taking a swing at my operation. This was intelligence. This was curiosity. Or maybe something even more deliberate than curiosity. Whoever had done this hadn't just dismantled the machine. They'd studied it, understood its systems well enough to lay it out like an anatomy lesson. And they hadn't taken a single piece. That detail kept pulling me back. Everything was still there. Nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed, nothing missing. Just rearranged. Just shown. The way you might show someone an open book and say, "Look at this." I read it. I understood it. I sat back on my heels and looked around the shed. The brush screen outside was undisturbed. The ground around the generator showed no footprints I could identify. No boot prints, no tire tracks. Nothing human in the conventional sense. Just a faint, wide impression in the mud near the doorway that I couldn't quite make sense of. Too broad for a foot. Too deliberate to be animal. I thought about the woven branches on the trail, the stones on the porch, the noise trap that had been lifted and set back down like a puzzle piece being examined. All of it suddenly connected in a way it hadn't before. Not as random acts of interference, but as a conversation. One side talking, one side not listening. They'd been trying to communicate this whole time, and I'd been answering with warning shots. I spent the rest of that day reassembling the generator by hand, following the layout they'd left me like a map. It took longer than it should have. My hands were still unsteady, and I kept stopping to look up, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those two tall figures watching from the edge of the hollow. But the woods stayed empty, patient, waiting. That night, I didn't arm the noise traps. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe something in me had shifted. Some instinct telling me that the barriers I'd built weren't protecting me from anything. They were just making the conversation harder. I should have listened to that instinct sooner. The fog came in thick 3 nights later. Not the light morning mist I was used to. This was a wall of it, heavy and white, rolling down from the northern ridge and filling the hollow until I couldn't see 20 feet past my porch. It swallowed the tree line, the woodpile, the path to the spring. By late afternoon, The cabin felt like the only solid thing left in the world. Everything else dissolved into gray nothing. I should have stayed inside, should have lit the stove, sat down, waited it out. That's what I'd done every other time the fog rolled in this thick. But something was pulling me out that evening, a restlessness I couldn't quite name, a feeling that the quiet wasn't empty, that it was full of something I couldn't see. So I grabbed the rifle and went out. I told myself I was checking the perimeter, making rounds, but the truth is I was looking for something, looking for them. After what I'd found in the generator shed, I needed answers more than I needed safety, and out here, there was only one way to get answers. You walked toward the thing that scared you, and you didn't stop until it showed itself. I made it about 100 yards down the northern trail when I saw the figure. Just one this time. A single shape, standing at the very edge of where the fog thinned enough to make out anything at all. It was tall. God, it was tall. And it wasn't moving. Just standing there, facing me, visible for maybe 3 seconds before the mist shifted and swallowed it whole. My heart slammed against my ribs. Every instinct I had said stop, turn around, go back to the cabin. But my feet kept moving. The rifle was up, my finger alongside the trigger guard, not on it, but close. Close enough. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. The figure appeared again, closer this time, maybe 40 yards ahead. And again it was just there, solid and enormous and utterly still, before the fog rolled between us and erased it. It wasn't running. It wasn't retreating in panic. It was moving at a pace just fast enough to stay ahead of me, just slow enough to make sure I kept following. And I followed. I should have known better. I should have recognized what was happening, that I was being led somewhere, that every step I took was exactly the step they wanted me to take. But the fog had closed in behind me by then, and I'd lost my bearings. The trail I thought I was on had disappeared under my feet, replaced by uneven ground and loose rock, and the kind of terrain that swallows you whole if you're not paying attention. Which I wasn't. Not enough. I caught one more glimpse of it, just the shape, massive and dark against the white. And then my foot caught on something, and the ground dropped away beneath me. The fall wasn't far, maybe 12 feet, maybe 15, but it was sudden and violent, and I hit the bottom of a dry riverbed with enough force to knock the wind out of me completely. The rifle clattered somewhere to my left. My head cracked against a flat rock, and the world went white, then dark, then somewhere in between where I could feel everything but couldn't move or see or think. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. Time didn't work right down there in the dark, with the fog pressing down from above and the cold of the stone bed seeping into my bones. When I finally opened my eyes, the fog was still thick, but the light had changed. Dimmer, grayer, the kind of light that comes late in the afternoon when the sun is already behind the ridge. I blinked, tried to sit up. My whole body ached like I'd been taken apart and put back together wrong. Then I turned my head and saw the rifle. It was lying beside me. Close enough to touch. But something was wrong with it. Something that took me a full 10 seconds of staring to register through the fog in my own head. The magazine was out, set neatly on the ground next to the rifle, parallel to it, like it had been placed there on purpose. The chamber was open, empty. Every round I'd been carrying, gone. Not scattered, not ejected in a panic. Removed, carefully, deliberately, one by one. Someone had taken my weapon apart while I was unconscious, unloaded it with a precision that spoke of understanding, not just of the mechanism, but of what it meant. They knew what a rifle was. They knew what the bullets did. And they'd chosen, very specifically, not to destroy it. They'd just taken away the part that made it dangerous. I lay there in that dry riverbed for a long time after that, staring up at the fog, listening to the silence. The panic I expected to feel never quite came. What came instead was something quieter and in some ways harder to sit with. A slow, creeping recognition that whatever was out here with me had had every opportunity to hurt me. Every single one. And they hadn't taken it. I climbed out of that riverbed just as the last light was dying. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the rock face. Every joint in my body ached from the fall, and there was a cut above my left eye that had stopped bleeding but left a crust of dried blood down the side of my face. I must have looked half dead climbing out of that ditch, which, thinking about it now, is probably exactly how I felt. The fog had thinned, not completely. It still hung in the hollows and pooled around the base of the trees, but enough that I could make out the trail again, or what I thought was the trail. I picked up the empty rifle out of habit more than anything. It felt wrong in my hands without the weight of the magazine, like holding a tool that had been gutted. I started walking back toward the cabin. Or what I hoped was back toward the cabin. The landscape looked different in the half-dark. The familiar shapes of the trees, rearranged by shadow and fog into something I almost didn't recognize. I'd lived in these woods for 19 years, and suddenly I felt like a stranger passing through them. That's when I felt it. Not saw it. Felt it first. A presence. Close. Close enough that I should have heard something. A footstep, a breath, the shift of weight on dry leaves. But there was nothing. Just a sudden, unmistakable awareness that I was not alone, the way you sometimes know someone is standing behind you in a dark room before you turn around. I turned around. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 15 feet away, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. Not as a shape in fog, not as a silhouette at the edge of a clearing. I saw it. Over 7 feet tall, covered in hair, not fur exactly, but something between fur and hair, a coarse gray-brown coat that hung close to its body and blended with the bark of the trees behind it. The face was broad, heavy-boned, with deep-set eyes that caught what little light remained and held it. It was looking at me the way I'd seen it look at me before, that slow, deliberate attention, not predatory, not curious exactly, something else, something I didn't have a word for. My hand tightened on the rifle. Empty or not, it was all I had. The being didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me with an expression. And I know how that sounds, I know, but there's no other word for it. An expression that was almost patient, like it had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was in no hurry to rush it. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. One word, a single syllable, low and rough, shaped by a throat that wasn't built for human language, but was trying anyway. The sound of it filled the hollow and settled into the air like smoke. Jonah. I stood completely still. The word hung between us, and for a long, disorienting moment, I thought it was calling me by a name. Some other name. Some name I didn't know I had. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, the way your mind does when reality cracks open, and something pours through that doesn't fit any shape you've seen before. But it wasn't my name. I understood that later, hours later, lying awake in the cabin with every light burning and the door barred. Jonah was its name, the creature's name. It was introducing itself. It was introducing itself to me. After that single word, it didn't speak again, not right away. Instead, it shifted its weight, a small movement, almost subtle, and raised one hand. The fingers were long, thicker than mine, the nails dark and curved. It pointed toward the ground between us, then back toward the direction of my cabin. A gesture, simple, unmistakable. That way. Go. But it wasn't done. Before I could move, before I could even breathe, really, it turned its head toward the north, toward the ridge where my still sat, and something changed in its face. The patience I'd seen before was still there, but underneath it now was something harder, something that looked almost like anger, or maybe closer to grief. It held that expression for a long moment, then looked back at me. And then it spoke again. 3 words this time, each one dragged out of that deep, rough voice like it cost something to produce them. The tone wasn't angry. It was firm, final. The way someone states a fact they've carried for a long time and are tired of keeping to themselves. Noise, chemicals, fire. It paused, let the words settle. Then it added, quieter, almost reluctantly, bad. The hollow went silent. The fog drifted between us like a curtain being drawn. Jonah, because that's what I called it from that point on, and I still do, held my gaze for one more long, steady moment. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not quickly, not in retreat. Just a slow, unhurried disappearance, the way the fog itself moves. Gradual, inevitable, and gone before you can find the exact moment it left. I didn't move for a very long time after that. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I barred the door, lit every candle I had, and sat in the middle of the floor with my back against the wood stove. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, turning those 3 words over and over in my mind, like stones in my palm, feeling the weight of them slowly settle into place. Noise, chemicals, fire. My operation, my still, my smoke, my water. It all connected, and the picture it made was one I wasn't ready to look at yet. It took me 2 days to accept what Jonah had told me. 2 days of pacing the cabin, replaying that single conversation in my head, turning the words over until they wore smooth like river stones. Noise, chemicals, fire. 3 words, 3 things I'd built my entire life around out here. And a being I couldn't explain had just stood in front of me and told me, in the plainest terms it could manage, that all 3 of them were wrong. I didn't want to believe it, not at first, because believing it meant something I'd spent 19 years avoiding. It meant I wasn't alone out here. It meant I'd never been alone. And it meant that everything I'd done, everything I'd built in this hollow, thinking it was mine, had been affecting someone else the entire time without me knowing. That realization sat in my chest like a bruise I kept pressing on. On the 3rd day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked the full perimeter of my operation, not to check security, not to patrol, to look, really look, the way Jonah had seemed to want me to. I started at the spring, where I tapped into the aquifer 200 yards from the cabin, and I crouched down beside the intake pipe and stared at it like I was seeing it for the first time. And in a way, I was. The chemicals I used in distillation, solvents, stabilizers, the small quantities of copper sulfate I added to certain botanical extracts, all of it went somewhere after the process was done. I'd always assumed it drained into the ground and dispersed. The soil out here was deep and porous, limestone beneath clay, and I'd never seen any visible runoff, never smelled anything wrong in the creek water downstream. I'd told myself the earth was absorbing it, neutralizing it, the way it does with everything eventually. But I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that made me feel sick, standing there with my hands in the cold mud beside that pipe. The aquifer, the same underground water source I tapped into for my spring. It ran deep beneath the hollow, threading through channels in the limestone that I'd never seen and never mapped. And somewhere along that network, my chemicals were leaching down, slowly, quietly, invisibly, contaminating water that someone else had been drinking from for far longer than I'd been alive. I didn't know that for certain, not yet. But standing there in the mud, with Jonah's words still ringing in my head, I felt it settle into place the way a key turns in a lock. It fit. Everything fit. The traps being dismantled, the trails being blocked, the objects left near my cabin, stones from the creek, bark from my smoke line, the antler found near the still. None of it had been random. None of it had been an attack. It had been a plea. Careful, patient, increasingly desperate attempts to make me understand what my operation was doing to their water, their home, their survival. And I'd answered every single one of those pleas with suspicion, with warning shots, with locked doors and armed patrols, and noise traps that snapped shut in the dark. I sat down in the mud beside the spring and put my head in my hands. The guilt hit me harder than I expected. Not the sharp, immediate guilt of getting caught doing something wrong. I'd lived outside the law long enough to be mostly numb to that. This was something deeper, slower, the kind of guilt that comes from realizing you've been causing harm without ever meaning to, without ever even noticing, and that your not noticing was its own kind of violence. I thought about the generator, the way they'd taken it apart and laid it out piece by piece. I'd read that as curiosity, as fascination with human technology. But what if it wasn't curiosity at all? What if it was an attempt to understand the source of the problem, to figure out what the machine did, how it worked, what it produced, because the effects of that production were showing up in their water and they needed to know why? They'd been trying to solve a problem I didn't even know I was creating. Over the next several days, I began to map the underground water system as best I could, following the creek upstream, tracing the limestone formations along the ridge, noting where the ground was softest and most likely to allow drainage. It was slow work, imprecise, done with nothing but instinct and observation. But piece by piece, a picture emerged. The aquifer ran in a deep channel beneath the northern ridge, the same ridge where I'd seen Jonah and the other being standing that foggy afternoon. The same ridge where the trails had been blocked. The same ridge that all of their signs had been pointing me away from. They lived up there, or near there, close to the water they depended on, the water I was poisoning. There were 4 of them. I figured that out gradually over the following week, from signs I finally knew how to read. 4 sets of impressions in the mud near the creek. 4 distinct patterns of movement through the woods at night. Subtle differences in the way branches were disturbed, in the spacing of footfalls, in the care with which they moved around my perimeter. 4 beings who had watched me for God knows how long, tried to communicate with me for months, and never once, not a single time, done anything to hurt me, even when I'd given them every reason to. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my cabin, listening to the creek outside, and tried to imagine what it felt like to watch someone poison your water and not be able to explain why it mattered. To leave signs and get warning shots in return. To be patient, impossibly, painfully patient, with a man who couldn't see what was right in front of him. I thought about Jonah's face when it had pointed toward the still. That expression I'd struggled to name, the one that was harder than patience, older than anger. It wasn't anger. I understood that now. It was exhaustion. The fire started on a Thursday. I know the exact day because I'd been keeping a rough log for the first time in years, scratching notes on the back of an old supply list, tracking the water channels, mapping what I could of the aquifer system. It was the closest thing to a record I had, and later, when I needed to piece together the timeline of everything that happened, those few scrawled lines were all I had to work with. Dry lightning. That's what started it. A storm had been building for days, pressure dropping, the air turning heavy and electric in a way I could feel in my teeth. But no rain came, just heat and static, and a sky that churned gray and green above the ridge like something alive. And then, sometime in the late afternoon, a bolt struck the dead timber on the eastern slope and caught. I didn't see it start. I was inside the cabin, sharpening a knife when I smelled it. That first thin thread of smoke that tells you something has gone wrong before your eyes confirm it. I went out on the porch and looked east, and saw the orange glow already climbing the hillside, moving fast through the dry brush and dead leaves that had been building up for weeks. My stomach dropped. I'd lived through fire season before. Every year out here was fire season, in one way or another. But this was different. This was moving too fast, too high, and the wind had shifted in a way that was pushing it directly toward my hollow, toward my cabin, toward everything I had. The first thing I did was grab the rifle, empty still, because I hadn't reloaded it since the riverbed. Old habit. The second thing I did was start moving. I tried the southern trail first. It was my fastest route out, half a mile to the creek crossing, then another mile through open ground to the county road. But within 200 yards, the smoke hit me like a wall. Thick, black, choking. I could barely see the ground in front of my feet, and the heat was building fast, the air shimmering and distorting the way it does above hot pavement in summer. I turned back. The fire was already closer than it had been 2 minutes earlier. I could hear it now, that low, constant roar that sounds less like burning and more like something breathing. I tried the eastern path next, blocked. Not by fire, by smoke so dense I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I stumbled back to the cabin coughing, my eyes streaming, and for the first time in 19 years of living alone in these hills, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. I felt helpless. The fire was closing in from 3 sides now. The only direction that wasn't burning was north, back toward the ridge, back toward the water, back toward the territory I now knew belonged to someone else. I stood on the porch and watched the flames crawl down the eastern slope toward my hollow, and I made a calculation I didn't want to make. If I stayed, I burned. If I went north, I was trespassing on ground that wasn't mine, moving deeper into territory I'd spent months trying to understand and still barely grasped. There wasn't really a choice. Not anymore. I grabbed what I could, the rifle, a canteen, the jacket off the hook by the door, and started up the northern trail at a near run. The smoke followed me, thinner here but still present, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs with every breath. The heat at my back was a living thing, pressing forward, and I could feel the temperature rising with every step I took away from the cabin. I'd been climbing for maybe 10 minutes when I saw Jonah. It was standing on the trail ahead of me, not blocking it, but positioned just to one side, like it had been waiting. The smoke curled around it, and in the orange-tinged light filtering down through the canopy, it looked almost spectral, almost unreal. But its eyes were very real, sharp and clear, and fixed on me with that same steady attention I'd seen before. It didn't speak, didn't need to. It turned and walked north, into the trees, and it looked back once, just once, to make sure I was following. I followed. The path it took me on was nothing I'd ever seen. Not a trail exactly, more like a gap in the forest, a narrow corridor where the trees thinned just enough to move through single file. The ground was different here too, harder, rockier. And beneath my feet, after another 100 yards or so, the earth gave way to stone. Old stone, worn smooth by water and time, sloping downward at an angle that felt ancient. A fissure, cut into the limestone by centuries of water flow, wide enough for a man to pass through, but invisible from the surface unless you knew exactly where to look. Jonah moved through it without hesitation, its massive frame navigating the narrow passage with an ease that spoke of a lifetime spent in these underground channels. I followed, one hand on the cold stone wall, the other gripping the empty rifle I still hadn't let go of. The passage opened up after maybe 50 yards into a wider chamber, not large, but enough to stand in, enough to breathe. The air here was different, cool, clean. The smoke from the fire above was gone, filtered out by the rock and the depth. I leaned against the wall and coughed until my lungs stopped burning. And when I finally looked up, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, I saw them. All four, standing in the dim light of the chamber, watching me with quiet, patient eyes. Jonah at the front, the others arranged behind it. Two larger, one smaller. All of them still and calm in a way that felt almost deliberate. Like they were showing me, on purpose, that they were not afraid. That they had never been afraid. Not of me, not of the fire, not of anything. Jonah raised one hand, that same slow, careful gesture I'd seen before, and pointed deeper into the chamber, toward a passage that led further down into the dark, away from the fire, away from everything burning above us. This way. I looked back toward the fissure entrance. Smoke was beginning to seep in now, thin gray tendrils curling through the crack in the stone. The fire was close, closer than I thought. I turned back to Jonah and nodded once, and I followed them into the dark. I don't remember much about the hours that followed. Fragments mostly. The cold of the stone beneath my hands as I crawled through passages too narrow to stand in. The sound of water somewhere below, steady, constant, ancient. The way Jonah's shape moved ahead of me in the dark, visible more as a presence than a form, guiding me deeper into the earth with a patience that felt like it had been there long before I ever set foot in these hills. At some point, I must have lost consciousness again. When I came to, I was lying on a flat stretch of rock beside an underground pool, and the air around me was cool and damp and perfectly still. The smoke was gone entirely. Above me, somewhere far above, the fire was still burning. But down here, in the belly of the limestone, none of it existed. I was safe. They had saved my life. That thought settled into me slowly, the way dawn comes in winter. Not all at once, but in degrees, each one a little harder to deny than the last. These beings, these creatures I'd spent months treating as a threat, firing warning shots at, setting traps against, had just led me through passages they'd kept hidden for generations to pull me out of a fire I couldn't have survived on my own. They could have let me burn. Every instinct I'd given them reason to feel toward me would have justified it. They didn't. I stayed underground for what I think was almost 2 full days. Jonah brought water, clean, cold, from the pool itself, and left it beside me without ceremony, without expectation. The others kept their distance, but they were there. I could feel them in the dark, moving quietly through the passages, going about whatever it was they did when the world above was on fire and closed off to them. On the second morning, or what I believed was morning, I sat up and watched Jonah for a long time as it worked near the edge of the pool. It was doing something with the water, collecting it in a hollow stone vessel, and the way it moved was so careful, so deliberate, that I understood for the first time what this water meant to them. Not just sustenance, not just survival, something deeper. Something that connected them to this place the way roots connect a tree to the earth it grows in. And I had been poisoning it, for years, without knowing, without caring enough to look. The guilt came back then, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy. The kind of weight that doesn't lift. It just becomes something you learn to carry. When the fire finally burned itself out, and the smoke cleared enough to emerge, Jonah led me back up through the fissures to the surface. My cabin was gone. The still was ash. The generator, the supply shed, the woodpile, all of it reduced to black and gray, and the smell of burned wood that hung over the hollow for weeks afterward. I stood in the ruins and felt something I hadn't expected to feel: relief. That was almost 4 years ago now. I rebuilt, smaller this time, a single-room structure, barely more than shelter, set back from the spring on ground that Jonah indicated, through gesture, through placement, through the quiet language we'd slowly begun to learn from each other, was safe. Away from the aquifer, away from the channels that fed their water. I run a much smaller operation now. Botanicals mostly. A few small distillations, done clean, with no chemicals that could reach the ground. Everything filtered, everything contained. It's not much, but it's honest in a way my old life never was. We have a system now. Not spoken, not agreed upon in any way a court would recognize, but real, consistent. Jonah and the others move through the hollow on their own schedule, and I give them space. In return, they've shown me things, water sources I never found on my own, passages through the rock that let me move unseen when I need to reach the county road. Sometimes they leave things near the cabin, not stones or bark anymore. Food, sometimes. Meat, cleaned and set on the flat rock beside my door, left without ceremony or expectation. And sometimes, in the early mornings when the fog sits low, and the light comes in thin and pale through the trees, I see Jonah standing at the edge of the hollow, just watching, not approaching, not retreating, just there, the way it's always been there, the way it was there long before I arrived, and will be there long after I'm gone. We don't speak much. We don't need to. I'm telling you this story now, all of it, from the beginning, not because I want you to believe me. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't. That's not the point. The point is this. I spent 19 years in these woods thinking I was alone, thinking the land belonged to me because I'd claimed it, thinking that if I was careful enough, quiet enough, hidden enough, I could take what I needed and leave no trace. I was wrong about all of it. And the terrifying thing, the thing that keeps me up at night, even now, is that I wasn't cruel. I wasn't malicious. I didn't come out here to hurt anyone. I came out here to disappear. And in disappearing, I caused more damage than I ever could have if I'd meant to. That's the real lesson. Not that monsters exist in the woods. Not that the world is stranger than we think, though it is. The lesson is that blindness is the most dangerous thing a person can carry. Blindness to what's around you. Blindness to what you're doing. Blindness to the fact that the world doesn't end where your awareness stops. I know how this sounds. A backwoods distiller, alone too long, seeing things in the fog. I know. But if any part of this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true, even a little, then I need you to do one thing for me. Pay attention. To the land you walk on, to the water you drink, to the quiet signs that the world is trying to show you something you're not seeing yet. Because someone out there, something out there, might be waiting for you to notice. And they might not have the patience forever. This story doesn't end here. There's more, things I haven't told yet, things that happened after the fire that I'm not ready to put into words. Not yet. But if you want to hear them when I am, stay close. Subscribe. Follow along. Leave a comment and tell me you're listening. Because out here, in the dark, it helps to know someone on the other side of this is paying attention. I'll be here. Same as always. Same hollow. Same hills. Same quiet. Just not alone anymore.